Have you ever believed that some men out there don't die from bullets or blades, but from the slow rot of silence, buried alive under memories they can't let go of? If that picture tightens your chest just a little, then stay with me. Because tonight, we're stepping into the life of Jonas Hale, a man who once wore a cavalry coat, once rode under the nation's flag, and now drifts like a ghost along the Montana frontier, where wind and guilt take turns eating away at what's left of his soul. But before we ride any further, give me a moment. If these words remind you of someone who's lost too much, someone who chose solitude because forgetting was harder than pain, then hit that like button to keep these Western stories alive. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Maybe a breezy porch out in the country. Maybe a quiet little room in town. Because somewhere out there, another man like Jonas is sitting in the dark, counting the breaths between one regret and the next, not sure why he's still alive. Jonas Hale had once been a sergeant with the 12th Cavalry Scouts, 12 years back. He rode escort through the red ridges of Dakota Territory, where the sun burned both skin and memory. In one raid, a Comanche ambush tore through their wagon train. Jonas lived. His younger brother, Eli, didn't. A bullet had gone through the boy's chest while Jonas was too far ahead to hear his last cry. They say soldiers are trained not to look back, but Jonas did. He saw his brother's eyes go dim. He saw his own hands dig the grave beneath December snow. After that, he was done with the army, with men, with everything. He walked away from the barracks and the men who once called him brother. With what little pay he had left, Jonas bought a patch of dry land west of Broken Mesa land nobody wanted, because the wind cut like knives and the dirt grew nothing but weeds. He built a small cabin by hand, plank by plank, from lumber scavenged off old barns. No one came to visit. No one asked. Jonas preferred it that way. He lived off the land, wild meat, a few chickens, and the occasional trip to town to trade hides for coffee, bullets, and salt. Each time he went, he kept his hat low, spoke little, paid quick, and left quicker. People whispered anyway. Some said he'd killed his brother in a fight. Others swore he was haunted by the dead. Jonas didn't argue. Whatever sin they imagined, it couldn't outweigh the only one that mattered surviving. At night, his cabin glowed with a single oil lamp, its light dull through the dusty window like the eye of a man who'd forgotten how to look at life. In the corner hung his old cavalry coat, covered in ash. The silver medal lay buried in a drawer under layers of dirt, untouched for years. Every dawn, Jonas rose before the sun. He brewed coffee thick and black, no sugar, no milk. He watched the horizon bloom red and wondered what right he had to see another day. Some mornings, he swore he could hear Eli's laughter carried on the wind, faint but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. He'd clench his fists until his nails bit the skin, just to remind himself he still belonged to the world of the living. 12 years passed, and no one ever knocked on his door. Jonas liked it that way, he told himself. The fewer ties a man has, the less he loses. But solitude never buried guilt. It only gave the echoes more room to live in. Sometimes, on cold nights, he'd stare east toward the low rise where Eli lay buried, under the pale moon. The crude carving on the wooden marker still haunted him. Eli Hale, the one not saved. He'd sit there for hours, not praying, not crying, just keeping watch, as if guarding a soul that refused to rest. That barren Montana land wasn't meant for the weak-hearted. But for Jonas, it was self-imposed exile, a punishment he understood and accepted. He didn't need forgiveness. He just needed to endure. But out on the frontier, peace never lasts long. One late autumn evening, when the wind began to shift and the sky turned the color of tarnished copper, Jonas heard something he hadn't heard in years, the sound of hooves on the hard trail leading toward his fence line. 3 riders appeared through the dust, and tied to one of their saddles was a young woman barefoot, bound, stumbling through the dirt like she'd just walked out of hell. Jonas didn't know it yet. But that single moment, those hooves, that woman, that choice would shatter 12 years of silence and force him to face the man he'd been running from all along, the one still breathing. Have you ever heard hoofbeats echo through an empty valley, steady but off rhythm, like the rider no longer had control of his own body? That wasn't the sound of travelers. It wasn't men coming home. It was the sound of liquor, fatigue, and trouble on horseback. Jonas Hale heard it before he saw them. He was crouched beside the well, rope rough in his palm, when the wind carried dust, sweat, and that faint metallic scent every man who's seen battle knows too well. He straightened, eyes narrowing toward the south trail, where the sun sagged low and the light had turned the color of tarnished brass. 3 riders emerged through the red haze. Their horses were thin, necks streaked with foam. The one in front wore an old cavalry coat, no insignia. No honor left. Beside him rode a man with a scar carved through his eyebrow. The third swayed on his saddle, stinking of whiskey even from a distance. Jonas didn't move. His hand hung easy at his side, but he'd already measured the distance to the Winchester leaning against the cabin door. He never liked unannounced company, especially in country where a wrong nod could end in gunfire. The lead rider raised a hand. "Evenin'." "Friend," he called, voice rough. "We come for a trade. Heard that black mare in your pen's ours work we done last spring. We're here to collect—" Jonas didn't flinch. "I don't owe you a damn thing," he said. Calm as dry stone. The man smirked. "Maybe not, but we brought something to make it fair." He jerked his chin toward the rear rider. That's when Jonas saw the rope tied from the saddle horn to a woman walking behind the horse. Barefoot, wrists bound tight in front of her, skin raw and red, her dress, torn hide and dust, clung to her body in tatters. Every step looked like it cost her more than she had left to give. Her head hung low, dark hair matted with dirt and sweat. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just walked. Silent as a condemned soul, Jonas felt the world go still. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of people who'd already been turned into things. The man in the cavalry coat stopped near the fence, caught her stealing down by the canyon. "The army don't want her, so we leave her here. Trade for your horse. And nobody argues." Jonas looked from her to them. He could feel the old weight in his chest, heavy as stone. He knew this kind of trade, seen it on frontier posts, where lives were swapped for bottles or bullets, refuse, and somebody would end up dead. "I don't trade people," Jonas said. "You ain't trading," the man replied, a smirk curling in his beard. "You're receiving." The air tightened. Jonas measured the ground between them. 3 half-drunk men, 3 guns, and 1 innocent who wouldn't survive another night. If leads started flying, more than 1 would hit the dirt. The woman stumbled, knees striking gravel. The scarred man laughed. "If she dies here, bury her or feed her to the wolves." "Your problem now." Jonas's jaw clenched. He knew what they wanted: rage, reaction, a reason. And that was exactly why he didn't move. "Finally," he said. "Take the horse and ride." The leader grinned wide. "Now we're talking sense." 2 of them dismounted, opened the corral gate, and led out the black mare. The woman they left tied to the fence post like she was nothing. When the men swung back into their saddles, one spat into the dirt. "She's yours now. Don't come looking." They kicked their horses and rode into the dusk, dust swallowing them whole. Jonas stood there a long time. He heard her shallow breaths, the creak of the rope, the whisper of wind through dry grass. In his mind, another voice rose, the voice of his brother, long buried. We don't walk past the helpless. Jonas, we never did. Jonas turned toward the cabin. Inside, he washed his hands, drank half a cup of water, and told himself it wasn't his concern. Soldiers would come, or Apache. Someone would find her. Either way, it wouldn't be him. But night came faster than he liked. The wind turned sharp and cold, dragging a coyote's cry across the plain. Jonas sat on the edge of his bed, listening. He wanted to ignore it, but something deep inside refused to stay quiet. He pulled on his coat, took his knife, and stepped outside. The moon was thin, the air raw. She was still there, leaning against the fence, her body trembling, bare feet cut and bleeding, her breath broken and uneven. Jonas stopped a few steps away. "You're not dying in my yard," he muttered. He cut the rope. Her legs buckled, and he caught her before she hit the dirt. Her skin burned with fever. She didn't speak, didn't fight. He lifted her light as bones and carried her inside. He laid her down on the spare bed, the one that had belonged to Eli, untouched for 12 long years. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she'd done. He just pulled a blanket over her shoulders, the lamplight trembling across the bruises on her arms. Outside, the prairie wind howled through the fences. But inside, for the first time in over a decade, a lamp burned again in Jonas Hale's cabin, its small, flickering glow the only proof that somewhere in that lonely stretch of Montana, a man who'd given up on the world had just chosen, against all reason, to care. Have you ever caught yourself doing something that made no sense at all, something your mind warned against, but your heart did anyway? Even a man who's gone half dead inside can still feel when another soul is hurting. Jonas Hale had sworn long ago never to interfere in anyone's business again. But the moment he cut that rope from the woman's wrists, he knew he'd just broken a 12-year promise to himself. He carried her inside light as a child, burning hot with fever. Her arms hung limp, her head fell against his shoulder, her breath thin as smoke. Jonas laid her on the bed that had once belonged to Eli, untouched since the day he buried his brother. The blanket smelled faintly of pine and thyme. For a while he stood there, back turned, afraid to face what he'd done. Lamplight spilled across her face, sunken cheeks, cracked lips, hair stuck to her skin. Bruises painted her shoulders and throat. Jonas felt something tighten deep in his chest. Not pity exactly, more like memory. He'd seen this before, men bleeding out on the sand, eyes begging for mercy no one could give. The sight brought it all back so sharply he had to look away. He filled a tin bowl, poured water from the jug, and set it by the bed. No thought, no words, just the habit of an old soldier patching the broken. His hands trembled as he wrung the cloth. The last time he'd done this. Eli was still breathing. She didn't stir. Jonas wiped the dust from her forehead, stopped when he found a small scar along her cheek, a mark of someone who'd known fear but never surrendered. "You didn't deserve this," he muttered, voice nearly lost to the air. He built a small fire, boiled water, mixed in the rough herbs he used for wounded horses. The bitter scent filled the cabin. He set the pot near her, hoping the warmth might keep her tethered to life. "Sitting down," he told himself. "When the sun comes up, I'll take her out of here. Nobody has to know." But the night stretched long. Every gust of wind pressed against the walls, and each time she moaned softly. He found himself beside her again, laying a steady hand on her shoulder. "Easy now," he said. "You're safe." He wasn't sure she understood, yet her lips moved faintly as if she tried to answer. He lifted her head, poured a little water between her lips, half spilled down her throat, but she swallowed some. His hands shook. It wasn't cold. It was fear of hurting her, fear of caring again. And he hadn't felt that kind of fear in years. By the time the fire burned low, he still hadn't slept. He stared at his calloused hands, the same hands that had once saved lives and buried too many. He'd told himself kindness was a luxury that got men killed. Yet here he sat, an old soldier keeping vigil for a stranger. When dawn began to gray the windows, Jonas realized he was still listening for her breathing. She was alive. The fever had eased, but her face stayed tense, as if trapped in a nightmare. He pulled the blanket higher and stepped outside. Mist hung over the fields, and for the first time in years, he felt his own heart beating loud in the quiet. He lit his pipe, coughed at the bitterness, and thought of the morning Eli died, how he'd carried him the same way. Trying to keep warmth in a body already gone cold. That memory pressed against him like the weight of the woman now sleeping inside. He feared losing another life under his watch. When he went back in, she was half awake, eyelids fluttering. Her hand gripped the blanket weakly. Jonas knelt down, voice rough. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, only blinked. He poured water into a cup and held it to her mouth. She drank in tiny sips, then whispered, hoarse and broken, "Don't. Go." He frowned. What again? Slower, don't go. This time he understood she didn't want to be left alone. He sat beside the bed, her dark eyes opened just enough to meet his, and what he saw wasn't fear, it was defiance. The last scrap of pride in a world that had tried to take it all. Jonas nodded. "No one's taking you anywhere." She closed her eyes, as if that promise was enough. He looked toward the window, where daylight seeped in pale and uncertain. He thought of soldiers, bounty riders. Maybe her own people, any of them could come. It didn't matter. Right now. If he walked away, she'd die before the sun was high, and he couldn't stand one more grave. He changed the water, washed the cloth again. When his hand brushed her skin, it wasn't as hot. The fever had begun to break. He sat there quietly, watching her breathe. "You don't know it," he murmured. "But you just made me remember what I tried to bury." Outside. The coyote's cries faded with the coming light. Inside. The first thin beam of morning crossed her face, softening the bruises, touching the lines of a man who hadn't wept in 12 years. Jonas didn't know who she was, or why fate had dragged her to his door. But as the light spread through the cabin, he realized one thing, with slow, aching clarity. Pity still lived inside him, and that meant he wasn't dead yet. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the narrow crack in the cabin wall, spilling across the face of the woman lying on Eli's old bed. Jonas Hale had been up since dawn, same as always, but this morning, there was another breath in the room, weak, uneven, but alive. He stood by the doorway, watching her. She was awake now, eyes half open, looking around like someone not yet convinced she'd survived the night. Jonas said nothing. He poured coffee from the blackened pot, letting the soft clink of metal fill the silence, just enough sound to tell her he meant no harm. She turned her face toward him, eyes cautious, scanning everything: the stove, the shelf, his old coat on the wall, the Winchester in the corner. Nothing in that room looked safe to her. She sat up slowly, blanket sliding down her shoulders, bandaged wrists trembling in the light. Her gaze darted toward the door, measuring the distance. Jonas noticed, but pretended not to. "There's water in the bowl," he said evenly. "Coffee's bitter. You hungry?" She didn't answer. Her amber eyes watched him like an animal that hadn't yet decided if it should run. Jonas recognized that look. It was the same kind he'd seen on half-starved Mustangs and wounded soldiers alike. He ladled out a bowl of beans, set it on the table, then stepped back. "I'll leave it here," he said quietly. She didn't move. The silence stretched thin, filled only by the wind scraping the eaves. Finally. She shifted, testing the truth of the moment. She swung her feet down, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and crossed the room. Every step looked like a negotiation. She sat at the table, halfway perched on the chair, ready to spring if she had to. Jonas didn't press her. He poured himself a cup, sat across the room, and watched the window instead of her. She ate slowly, as if she didn't quite trust the food to stay in her stomach. Her hands shook, her eyes, though stayed sharp, often flicking toward the rifle in the corner. He saw it. He gave a small nod, the kind that said, "It's all right. You have your reasons." When she finally stopped eating, he spoke. "You speak English." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Little. Good enough," he said. "You stay here till you can walk." She frowned. "You, not take me away?" Jonas shook his head. "No, I don't hand people over." The air shifted at that. She looked at him longer, as if weighing the truth of the words. They spoke no more for hours. Jonas worked outside, splitting firewood. Through the doorway, he could feel her eyes on him. Each time he turned, she shrank back, pretending to busy herself. When he carried the wood in, she moved to the far side of the room, keeping that careful space between them, an invisible fence neither of them tried to cross. Around midday, her voice came, quiet but steady. "Your name?" Jonas turned. "Jonas." She nodded once. "I'm Nayeli." The name lingered in the air like a chord of music, soft, proud, and unfamiliar. Jonas repeated it under his breath. Nayeli. It sounded like wind sliding across stone. "Pretty name," he said. She didn't reply, just watched him for a moment, then looked away. By late afternoon, the sky turned heavy with clouds. Jonas was mending the front door hinge when he saw her standing by the stove, still wrapped in the blanket. She didn't fear the fire, but she didn't relax either. Every movement he made, she tracked, her body coiled like a wire. "No one's going to hurt you here," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward him. Skeptical. "I can't speak for anyone else," he added. "But not me." That plain truth, not soft, not rehearsed, seemed to ease something in the air. Nayeli gave the smallest nod, though her guard stayed high. When she reached for the firewood, Jonas stepped forward to help. She stopped him with a single glance. "I do it." Her voice, though hoarse, carried a spine of steel. Jonas backed off. "All right." They stood apart, both watching the flames. No words, just the sound of crackling wood. But in that silence, something began to shift. Jonas no longer saw her as a stranger dropped into his life, and she, perhaps, no longer saw him as a man waiting for a chance to harm her. That night, she returned to the bed. Jonas spread a blanket near the hearth, close enough to hear her breathing, far enough not to frighten her. The fire cast soft orange light across the room. She didn't sleep right away. Every now and then, she looked his way. Jonas kept still, eyes half closed, pretending not to notice. After a long while, her voice rose in a whisper. "Jonas." He stirred. "Yeah, you. Don't call me slave." He shook his head. "No one has that right." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then she said, barely audible, "Thank you." Jonas turned toward the fire, saying nothing. But deep down, he knew her guard was still up, and might stay that way for a long time. Yet the silence between them no longer felt like fear. It was a fragile kind of truce, born of two broken souls who'd stopped running just long enough to share the same roof. Jonas lay listening to the wind brush against the cabin walls. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And Nayeli, though she still clutched the blanket tight around her shoulders, no longer held her breath in terror. In that space between them, not too close, not too far, something wordless began to take root. They started to understand each other, not through speech, but through glances, through stillness, and through the hesitant, flickering trust of two lives learning how to be human again. On the third morning, the fog hung thick over the land, like the earth was breathing in its sleep. Jonas Hale was up before dawn. Same as always. He built a fire, poured coffee, and fixed a simple breakfast: beans, dried meat, a few stale corn cakes. Nayeli still slept, her head turned to one side, strands of black hair spilling across her arm. She looked peaceful, but Jonas knew there was no such thing as peace in whatever story had brought her here. When she woke, he set the bowl down on the table. She ate slowly, still wary, but not as stiff as before. Between quiet pauses, Jonas asked softly, "When you're strong enough, where will you go?" She hesitated, staring into the fire instead of at him. "I look for my people. Your family," he asked, trying to keep his tone even. "My father. He is Tanya, chief of the Red Coyote band." Jonas froze. For a long second, even the wind outside seemed to stop. He lowered his cup, fingers suddenly heavy. That name Red Coyote, he'd heard it too many times from soldiers, from cattlemen, from men whispering around campfires. That tribe wasn't known for mercy. They'd ambushed cavalry columns at Bear Hollow, burned supply wagons at Dry Fork. And Tanya, the talking ghost, as the men called him, was both respected and feared. "You're saying Tanya is your father?" Jonas asked quietly. She nodded, eyes steady, not proud, not pleading. "He still lives. I never saw his body." Jonas stepped back. His heart thudded heavy in his chest. He didn't know what was worse, that she might be telling the truth, or that he'd just realized he was sheltering the daughter of one of the most dangerous Apache chiefs on the frontier. He moved to the door and looked out toward the horizon. No smoke, no riders. But if Red Coyote scouts were out there, he'd never see them until they wanted him to. "Listen," he said, turning back. "If your people find out you're here with me..." She cut him off, her voice calm and cold as stone. "They kill you." The words hit like a bullet, no threat, just fact. Jonas stared at her, and she didn't flinch. He turned back to the window, staring out across the rust-colored plain. Memories crept up: raids, screams, bodies, fire. He'd heard the name Red Coyote whispered over blood and ash before, and now he'd invited that bloodline into his own home. He spent the rest of the morning in silence, working outside but thinking of nothing else. If they come, what do I do? Run useless? Fight suicide? Hand her over? That'd make him no better than the men who left her tied to a fence, inside the cabin. Nayeli sat near the window, mending her torn dress with a thread he'd given her. Her hands worked slow, but her eyes never stopped scanning the distance. She wasn't afraid, she was waiting. When Jonas came back in, sweat streaking his neck, he offered her a dipper of water. "You sure they'll come?" he asked. She nodded. "If my father lives, they follow his tracks. If he dies, another takes command. Either way, someone comes. And if they find you here, with me..." Her gaze didn't waver. "They think you take me. They kill first. Ask later." Jonas sat down heavily on the bench, elbows on his knees. He could almost see them already, riders on the ridge, faces painted, rifles low. If they came, there'd be no talking them down. "You can go, when you're strong enough," he said finally. "I won't stop you." She didn't move. "I not go," she said quietly. "If I go, you die sooner." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "They see me run. They think you hurt me. But if I stay, I can speak truth." Jonas looked up, studying her. Those dark eyes steady, sharp, Unblinking held both danger and mercy. "You trust me that much?" he asked. "I don't trust," she said flatly. "But I owe you life." The words landed heavier than he expected. He turned away, jaw tightening. He'd never wanted anyone's debt, least of all one that might get him killed. By afternoon, the clouds thickened like a wound that wouldn't close. Jonas fixed the corral gate, but every sound set his nerves on edge: the caw of a crow, the slap of wind, even the creak of a rope. He felt watched. Inside. Nayeli tended the fire. Jonas came in, wiped his hands, and said quietly, "If they come, you speak first. I'd like to know what I'm dying for." She looked at him, unblinking. "If they come, I tell them you saved me. Whether they listen, I don't know." Jonas nodded slowly. "Then we'll find out." When night fell, silence settled thick over the land. Jonas sat by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the pale horizon. The moon was thin, and the wind had changed bad signs for anyone who'd lived long in border country. Behind him, Nayeli lay still, awake but wordless. Only when a lone coyote cried in the distance did Jonas realize his heartbeat had quickened. For the first time in years. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing something he'd only just begun to understand. And he knew, from the moment she spoke the words, Red Coyote, their fates had twisted together on a path with no turning back. The wind shifted at first light. Jonas smelled the faint trace of smoke long before he saw anything an unmistakable warning in this country. Smoke meant people, hunters, travelers, or trouble coming closer. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes narrowing toward the eastern ridge, where the fog still clung to the rocks. No movement, no sound. But the instincts that had kept him alive all these years whispered the truth: someone's out there. Inside the cabin, Nayeli was tying her torn shirt with a strip of cloth. She froze when she saw him standing rigid at the doorway. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Smoke," Jonas said without turning. Less than a mile out. She came to his side, looking past his shoulder. In her eyes, he saw not fear but alertness, sharp and trained. "Not soldiers," she said, after a long breath. "Smoke low. Wet wood." "My people burn that way." Jonas felt his stomach tighten. "How many?" "3," she answered. "Maybe 4. How far?" She raised her chin toward the wind, reading it as naturally as if it spoke to her. "Half an hour." He glanced around the yard. Nowhere to hide, just a few scrub bushes and the empty corral. "If they find you here, they kill you," she finished, calm as stone. Jonas went back inside and reached for the Winchester hanging over the door. His hands were steady, though his breath had grown heavier. "I won't run," he said, "but I'm not looking to shoot anyone, either." Nayeli nodded. "Let me speak first. You think they'll listen if they're Red Coyote? They'll listen before they kill." He looked at her then, and in that moment, the frail, broken girl he'd carried into this cabin was gone. Standing before him was something else entirely straight-backed, steady-eyed, the quiet fire of a leader's blood in her face. He understood then she wasn't just a survivor. She was a chief's daughter. The horses came as the sun broke the horizon 3, just as she'd said. Dark shapes moving along the ridge, slow, silent, deliberate. Not soldiers, not drunks, warriors. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, muzzle pointed down. He wanted no misunderstanding. Nayeli stepped beside him, blanket around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the ridge. "It's them," she said. "Black horses. Red leather on the tails. My father's mark." Jonas nodded once. "I'll keep quiet." She didn't look at him. "They'll look at me first." When the riders emerged fully from the haze, the air seemed to stop moving. The leader was older, hair braided and streaked with gray, beads and wolf claws around his neck. The 2 younger men behind him carried rifles slung across their backs. They stopped 30 yards from the cabin. faces carved from stone. Jonas didn't move. "She's alive," he said clearly. "I didn't hurt her." Before the words could hang in the air, Nayeli stepped forward, wind tugging at her hair. The bruises along her neck showed in the light. She raised her chin and spoke in Apache, her voice steady, ringing, almost regal. The old man's eyes hardened. He answered, low and sharp. Nayeli replied again, louder this time. And Jonas understood without understanding. She was defending him. One of the younger riders urged his horse forward, hand slipping toward his gun. Jonas felt his pulse spike. He tightened his grip on the Winchester but didn't lift it. A wrong move now would mean blood hers, or all of theirs. Nayeli turned on the young warrior and spoke fast, voice like steel. The man froze, hand falling away from his weapon. Wind stirred the leather tassels on the saddles. No one spoke. The exchange went on for minutes that felt like hours. Jonas stood still, the weight of every second pressing on his chest. At last, the old warrior dismounted and walked closer. His gaze flicked between them. "You save her?" he asked in rough English. Jonas nodded. "Cut her loose, fed her, didn't buy her, didn't keep her." The man studied him long and hard, eyes narrowing as if trying to see through him. Then he said something to Nayeli. She answered, her tone softer now, but firm. After a long pause, the man turned back to Jonas. "She is Tanya's daughter." "I know," Jonas said quietly. "I didn't plan it." The old warrior's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Good. If you lie, you die." "I figured," Jonas said dryly. A silence fell. Then Nayeli spoke again, this time in English, so both sides could hear. "He did not take me. I stay because I choose." That sentence hung in the air like a flag between two armies. The old man blinked, then nodded slowly. The younger riders eased in their saddles. He placed a hand on his chest and spoke again. "We follow trail. Men who hurt her, we find them." Jonas pointed south. 3 men. One with a scar on his forehead. One wears a soldier's coat. One sounds Texan. They went toward Broken Mesa. The man absorbed the details, then mounted his horse. Before he left, he spoke a short phrase to Nayeli in their language. She replied softly, her eyes steady. When he turned to go, she said to Jonas, "They will not kill you. I told them you speak truth." Jonas exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from his chest. "Appreciate that," he said. "But what if they come back?" "They will," she answered. "When they find the others, and when my father knows I live." The 3 riders disappeared into the rising light, their silhouettes fading behind the ridge. Jonas watched until the dust settled, and silence returned. The wind moved again, but the quiet it brought was uneasy. Inside, Nayeli sat down, hands trembling faintly, though her eyes remained strong. Jonas glanced at her. "I thought you'd go with them." She shook her head. "No. I told them I stay until you are safe." Jonas opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know what to say. He just sat there, one hand resting on the rifle that, for once, didn't feel like protection, but a burden. Outside, the wind carried the fading echo of distant hooves. Inside, 2 lives, one scarred by guilt, the other by chains, had crossed a line neither could step back from. And for the first time in 12 long years, Jonas felt something stirring under the fear. Not doom, not relief, but a fragile, dangerous thing called hope. By the next morning, there was no smoke on the horizon, no hoofprints in the dirt, only wind sweeping through dry grass and the faint groan of an old fence. Jonas Hale sat on the porch, coffee gone cold in his hand, staring toward the ridge where the Apache riders had vanished. He knew they'd be back someday. But what stayed on his mind wasn't the threat, it was the woman inside his cabin. sweeping the floor as if she belonged there. Nayeli moved slowly, deliberately, every motion quiet but sure. The blanket she'd once clung to now lay folded on the bed. She wore one of Jonas's old shirts, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and his worn-out boots that were too big for her feet, but already breaking in. She didn't ask before doing anything, she simply did, like someone who'd decided this place was home long before she said it aloud. When Jonas stepped inside, she was pouring water into the pot of beans simmering over the fire. He lingered at the doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Yes," she answered without turning. "I'm hungry." Jonas chuckled quietly, the first real laugh he'd managed in weeks. "Then you might as well cook enough for both of us. You can help," she replied evenly, "or stay out of the way." He went outside, and strangely enough, it felt good to be told what to do. There was life in the cabin again, a rhythm, soft and ordinary, that replaced years of silence. At noon, they ate together. The meal was simple, but the quiet between them was no longer heavy. Afterward, Jonas asked, "You think they'll come back for you?" "Maybe," she said, wiping her hands. "But not today. Until then, I stay." Jonas frowned. "I thought you wanted to go back to your people." She looked straight at him. "I want to choose where I live. Not them. Not you." There was no defiance in her tone, just certainty. And for the first time, Jonas understood she wasn't staying out of debt or fear. She was staying because she wanted to live freely, on her own terms. That afternoon, they worked outside together. Jonas fixed the roof of the stable while Nayeli hauled water from the well, scrubbing the rusted pails until they shone faintly in the sun. When a gust of wind whipped through, he turned and saw her standing in the light, hair lifting, eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips. Not a smile for him, but for herself for the first time in years. She looked unchained. "Ever done that before?" he asked, hammer still in hand. "Draw water," she said. "No. My father never let his daughters touch the rope. He said our hands were for medicine, not for work." Jonas grinned. "You're better at it than me. That's because I'm not afraid to get dirty." She bent down, still smiling faintly. That evening, they sat by the fire with bowls of beans and smoked meat. Jonas lit his pipe, the red glow flickering across the lines of his face. "You know," he said, voice rough, "I haven't shared a roof with anyone since Eli died." Nayeli looked at him across the firelight. "I haven't lived without fear since the day I was taken." Two simple sentences, but they met somewhere between them, like sparks striking flint. After that, there wasn't much talking. They didn't need it. The sound of breathing, the scrape of tin plates, the steady crackle of the fire, that was enough. The next morning, Nayeli followed Jonas out to the corral. She wanted to learn how to handle the horses. When he let out the gray mare, it jerked its head, snorting dust in her face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered something in Apache. The horse stilled. Jonas blinked. "What did you just tell her, that she's not a slave?" Nayeli said softly. "Same as me." Jonas laughed. "Maybe she listens to you because you don't try to order her." "Maybe," she said with a small smile. By late afternoon, they sat together on the porch steps. Neither spoke. The valley spread before them, golden and empty. A flock of crows drifted over, their shadows crawling across the ground. Jonas looked sideways at her, hands resting on his knees. "You know," he said slowly, "if you want to stay here, I won't stop you." Nayeli met his eyes, calm and unshaken. "I told you already. I stay because I want to." He nodded, saying nothing more. But deep inside, something long frozen began to thaw. That night, they shared the same fire again, she sewing a torn sleeve, he sharpening a knife. Outside, The wind moaned against the walls, but inside there was warmth, the quiet rhythm of two people learning to live beside each other. Before bed. She stood by the window, looking at the low-hanging moon over the ridge. "Tomorrow," she said, "you teach me to shoot." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Why would you want that?" "Not to kill," she said softly. "To be free like you." Jonas smiled, shaking his head, but there was pride in his eyes. "Freedom," he said, "always has a price." "Then I'll pay it with you," she replied. It wasn't a vow, nor a confession. But to Jonas, it felt like someone had lit a lantern in a house that had been dark for too long. That night, lying awake, he no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. And Nayeli, closing her eyes by the fading fire, knew she was no longer just surviving, she was beginning again. Neither of them said it out loud, but both understood they were staying not out of debt, not out of fear, but because somewhere between two wounded hearts, freedom had finally found its shape. That morning, the sun seemed to rise slower than usual, or maybe it was just Jonas who felt that way. Light slid gently through the cabin shutters, spilling across the worn wooden floor and painting everything in a warm gold. The smell of coffee mingled with wood smoke and earth. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and quiet, the cacti lifting their thorned arms toward the new day. Jonas Hale sat at the small table, rough hands wrapped around a tin mug. Across from him, Nayeli was folding the thin blanket she had mended the night before. Neither spoke, but the silence between them wasn't hollow anymore. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, the stillness of people who've survived. The Apache girl, who had once stumbled into his life like a shadow in the desert, had stayed. Not because she owed him anything, not because of pity, but because she wanted to. And somehow, Jonas had accepted that as naturally as breathing. He rose, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped outside. The morning wind carried the scent of dust and hay. Nayeli followed, carrying a basket of seeds and a handful of dried onions. They didn't talk much. Both understood that some things didn't need words. A glance, a nod, a small smile was enough to say, "We're still here." They started planting a small patch of ground behind the cabin. The soil had been dry for years, cracked and lifeless. But that morning, Jonas sank the shovel into it, and Nayeli knelt beside him, digging small holes with her fingers, pressing seeds into the earth, covering them with care. Sunlight caught in her hair, turning it the color of copper flame. Jonas watched her for a moment, just a moment, and felt something stir quietly inside him. At noon, they rested under the porch. Jonas wiped sweat from his brow and struck a match for his cigarette. Nayeli leaned back against the post, eyes half closed. "This land used to be dead," he murmured. "No land dies," she replied softly, not opening her eyes. "It just waits for someone to believe in it again." Jonas turned away, the words catching somewhere deep in his chest. Maybe it wasn't the land that had died. Maybe it was him. Later that afternoon, they led the horses to the creek. Nayeli stepped barefoot onto the sand, leaving small prints beside his boot tracks. She splashed water over her face and laughed, a light, bell-like sound that startled Jonas in its rarity. It had been so long since laughter had felt real around this place. And hearing it now, he realized how deeply he had missed it. That evening, the western sky turned to fire, fading into deep indigo. Jonas built a small fire inside, the glow flickering against the log walls. Nayeli sat nearby, combing her long dark hair, each strand reflecting the orange of the flames. "Ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He shook his head. "I used to. But leaving doesn't fix what you carry inside." She nodded. "Then stay, but live different." He looked at her, amused. Different how? Not just breathing, See where the wind goes." He laughed under his breath, and so did she. For a moment the cabin felt young again. Days passed. They mended fences, fixed the barn roof, patched holes in the walls. Jonas found himself surprised at how naturally Nayeli worked her small hands gripping the hammer, her shoulders steady. She wasn't a wounded stranger anymore. She was part of the land, same as he was. One morning, she carved something into the porch beam, a small crescent moon crossed by a single line. "What's that?" Jonas asked. "A mark for home," she said. "My people carve it when they choose a place to live." He stared at it for a long while. He didn't need her to explain further. That mark said everything. When the rains came, the ground around the cabin turned dark and rich. The seeds they'd planted began to sprout tiny green shoots pushing through mud and ash. Jonas crouched down, touched one of the fragile leaves, and felt its damp strength beneath his fingers. "See," Nayeli said softly beside him. "The earth doesn't forget how to live. Neither do people." That night, they shared a simple supper by the fire, cornbread and beans. No words about the past, no talk of fear or loss. Only the crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of two people who no longer needed to fill silence. Jonas looked around the cabin, the same four walls that had once been a shell of loneliness. Now there was light, the smell of food, the faint echo of laughter. He realized that peace wasn't about nothing happening. It was about having someone to share the quiet with. Nayeli rested her head on his shoulder. Her voice was low. "Now this place is our home." Jonas smiled faintly. "No. Nayeli, you made it one. If you've followed Jonas and Nayeli this far, maybe you've felt what they found, not passion, but peace. Out there on the barren land, two broken souls learned that home isn't something you stumble upon. It's something you build. Together, one quiet day at a time. And maybe you, too, have known what it feels like to lose something that once defined you. Maybe, like Jonas, you've stood in silence, afraid to start again. But take a page from their story. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the courage to believe that life can grow back. If you believe Jonas and Nayeli deserve that chance to keep rebuilding, leave a small sign, maybe a like, maybe a comment like the mark she carved into the porch beam. Because sometimes, the quietest people are the ones who remind us how to listen and how to live again.